Welcome to our weekly Facebook Live. I'm Deborah Bonello, Senior Investigator at Insight Crime, and I'm joined by our co-director, Stephen Dudley. Hey, Stephen.
Hi, Deborah. How you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
Good, thanks.
So today we're going to be talking about our investigation into mayors in the Northern Triangle, and we're going to start off by looking at the latest part of the investigation, which was published today. Steve, talk us through that trip and what it was like being in Yoro, and kind of what the look and feel of it and what kind of reception you got there.
Yeah, just to kind of set the scene a little bit, the place that we wrote about is a huge municipality. It's one of the largest municipalities in Honduras. It's in, let's call it northeastern, kind of a northeastern section of Honduras, at least northeast of the capital, Tegucigalpa. Huge department, or what we would call state in the United States, and it's kind of buried in this northern, at least at the base of this northern mountain range. Remote in the sense that it's a couple hours drive over pretty bad roads, not very well kept roads from the industrial capital of the country, San Pedro Sula. We in fact got a flat tire on the way, just to give you an idea of how bad the roads are. Mostly kind of bumpy and, sort of your unexpected, pothole, those sorts of things. The area is, or at least used to be, just absolutely covered with timber. And this timber is part of the licit and illicit economy running up there. In Yoro. It's an area that's sparsely populated, an area that has very remote villages that are buried deep in these mountains, including one mountain range they call Loco Mapa, which literally translates as crazy map, because I guess it's very hard to navigate. It's a reference also to a river there, and this is where this family that we chronicle in this story, the Urbina Soto family, had made its base, and it really expanded its criminal enterprise there. So this is kind of just setting the scene a little bit in this place called Yoro.
So when you got there, what kind of sort of reception did you get when you started sort of asking around about this family? Because obviously they're hugely influential.
Well, the story centers on this family, of course, but the one of the members of the family, who's a lawyer, the only lawyer in the family, who became mayor. He became mayor during in 2009, during a time period in which this family was beginning to establish itself in many respects, in both its licit and illicit activities. They've long had a lot of land. Their father was actually mayor, and so they have a political lineage there. They've had cattle and other land holdings for a very long period of time, and they have harvested timber for a long period of time. And the son then decided that he was going to get back into politics and won the mayor's office in 2009, then subsequently used the mayor's office in order to help the family expand their criminal operations. So these criminal operations were varied. I mean, they had a number of different things going on. Probably the most noteworthy one, and maybe the most lucrative one, although we don't know because we haven't seen their ledgers, was that they facilitated the movement of drugs through that area, through this very remote mountainous area. They set up, at least by the accusations made by the government, the Attorney General's office, they established sort of hidden runways or secret runways in this Loco Mapa area mostly, but in other areas as well, where aircraft could come in and land that was filled with drugs. The aircraft would then deposit the drugs in the area. This criminal operation would hold those drugs and then subsequently move those drugs onto another criminal organization that would continue the trip north. Presumably most of these drugs would land in the United States is the presumption. So they were part of that chain.
This is the mayor's family then that is helping.
This is the mayor's family, exactly.
Yes. How involved on a hands-on basis do you think the mayor was, and how did physically how did that process take place? Was it cousins, or were they paying people to do that, or how did it work?
Right, a couple of ways that being the mayor actually facilitates this process. One is that they actually were very involved in land theft. So they would literally go in and displace people from their lands, at least according to the Attorney General's investigation. They would displace people, and then they would take over those lands. And when they took over those lands, they would need to get titling for those lands. So the fact that the mayor controls the titling office facilitated this process. It was said that they also they had access to some of the machinery. So literally like backhoes and other things to actually make the secret runways. So this is another way in which, having the mayor in your pocket would facilitate this type of criminal activity. And of course, probably the most important thing is that the mayor has a lot of influence, although not direct control, a lot of influence over the police. They aren't necessarily the ones who are like, they don't have, they can't name the police chief or anything like that, although they might have a say in that. But they can provide certain elements to the police and cajole the police and point the police in certain directions or others. So there's a lot of ways in which being a mayor can assist in operations like this. And this is what the Attorney General's office presumes was happening. They were facilitating this process, ensuring that they weren't getting prosecuted. This family was involved not just in drug trafficking, or at least facilitating the trafficking of these drugs through that area, but they were also involved in local drug peddling. They were involved in the trafficking of timber. They were involved, as I mentioned earlier, in land theft and in possibly cattle rustling or cattle theft and resale. So this is a family that was that had quite a criminal portfolio, if you will, at least according to the investigation by the Attorney General's office.
And I mean, I would really interested to know, the communities in these villages, in these towns that are so controlled by these political elites. I mean, when you speak to just regular people, is there a fear? I mean, I'm assuming that violence is always a part of the way that these schemes run. I mean, how are they perceived by just the regular people that you spoke to about and how aware are people of this going on and their involvement?
Yeah. This is, it really varies from place to place. We've done investigations where we just published one last week where we had tremendous access to the current mayor, who has been accused, not formally, but informally by various authorities of having strong contacts to drug trafficking operations. And that access was fairly simple, fairly straightforward. Pretty much, I got his telephone contacts, WhatsApped him a few times. He WhatsApped me back, and then I visited him. I mean, it was that straightforward. And talking with people in that town was pretty straightforward. He invited us to attend a couple of meetings there that he presided over. So it was, very straightforward. People didn't seem very fearful. We talked to all kinds of people there. So that was one example. But in this example, people were very fearful. They were very fearful of this family. The The nominal head of the criminal organization is the mayor's, or at least ex-mayor now, ex-mayor's older brother, and we can get to that in a minute, what has happened to the mayor since. But the ex-mayor's older brother, Carlos Fernando Urbina Soto, is thought to be the nominal head and a very violent figure. When they did the raids after the investigation had begun, and they gathered up enough information to raid the families and others who participated in these criminal activities' houses, they found multiple assault rifles and flak jackets and other types of equipment, lights and other things that you would need in order to, both, fend off any sort of rival, but also to land aircraft late in the evening hours on secret airstrips. So there was a lot of circumstantial evidence and things like that, but there was a lot of fear. So it was hard for them to pull together a very solid case. And to be honest, they did not pull a very solid case together. They were based a lot on rumors, some direct testimony, but the testimony came from people that often, had heard it third hand, or they said they weren't able, the investigators said during the court proceedings, they weren't able to go back because they were fearful. So in this case, they were so fearful. Everybody was so fearful, both from the witness side to the authority side, at least as stated on the record, that it made it very hard for them to prosecute the multiple members of the family. And indeed, everybody in the family was found not guilty except for the mayor. The mayor was found guilty of money laundering and is being charged for other crimes as well. He remains in jail following those raids. But the rest of the family is free. And in fact, the sister, just one more point, the sister, who is a major politician, looks sure to win the elections next month as the new mayor. So their family will then presumably reestablish themselves and everything around it.
Now I want to move on to it, asking about kind of the different political levels. But before that, I mean, do you think that the inadequacy of the investigation is a reflection of a combination of that with just sort of a lack of efficiency in terms of local law enforcement?
Well, it's always a combination of things. There isn't necessarily one thing that can lead an investigation to be poorly
astonishing, the transcripts and the questioning, even the most basic of facts just weren't there.
They just weren't there. Yeah, I mean, the circumstantial evidence leads you to think that perhaps this family was very deeply involved in criminal activities. We don't know what other corroborating evidence they have or witness statements they have. I mean, this family, for example, worked with another major criminal operation, in fact, the major criminal operation in the country, a criminal operation that went under the name of Los Cachitos. The Cachitos, it was also a family-run organization. And they have turned themselves into United States authorities, so presumably they could corroborate much of the, at least their presumptions from the evidence they've gathered. If they go and talk to the Cachitos, I don't know what kind of access they've had there. Other drug trafficking, suspects have been arrested, so they could corroborate evidence in that way, or they could corroborate statements in that way. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that they simply did not do. I mean, simply corroborating what happened to land titles, for instance, that wasn't done. They certainly didn't run down a lot of the stuff, a lot of the accusations around the timber trafficking. So there's an agency out there, for example, and this is another advantage of having the mayor, is that the mayor plays a major role in naming who's the head of the person who runs the timber regulatory agency out there. And that person also was presumably in cahoots with them and they could harvest timber from places that they weren't supposed to harvest timber from. They were supposedly fixing prices with the middlemen, or at least the middle companies that were going and buying in bulk. They were displacing people from their land, and then they could then harvest timber from that land. But none of those leads are run down. So it's really hard to say what's true and what's not true, what's kind of folklore and what's reality. The reality is they were found not guilty, and the sister is about to be mayor again. And and I don't know whether or not we titled the last section, meet the a reference to the famous Who song, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, in that essence, and that's in that vein.
Well, talking of bosses, and you mentioned the cachiros, over the last couple of months, we've seen some prominent cases of Honduran drug traffickers in the US pointing the finger. Now, what kind of relationship did you find between the local level politics in Honduras and the federal, the presidency and the sort of the more centralized forms of government? How did those connect? Did those connections exist, and how did those relationships work?
The Cachitos case has been at the center of all of this. At least all of our understanding about these relationships between elites, political and economic elites, and organized crime for some time now, in part because of the investigations that we've done, but in part because there were some unprecedented public declarations in the United States court during the strangest of circumstances, a sentencing trial of Fabio Lobo, the son of former President Porfirio Lobo. And what we know from those statements is absolutely jaw-dropping, in the sense that their connections were not just sort of through intermediaries or third parties. They were direct. I mean, they were working directly with people who had direct access to the highest levels of office. No one even bothered to have any sort of, middle person that could separate them or give them some kind of distance from these figures. In fact, there are photographs of, these guys with Porfirio Lobo, who was at that point, I believe, gearing up to be president, or he'd shortly been elected president. I'm not sure what the timing was. I can't remember right now, but that certainly would give an indication that their support was direct, ongoing, and right there, like right in the same room, not even through a third party. That's the most stunning part of this. So,
that speaks to.
Yeah. Sorry?
The audacity of that, I think, reflects something important about the system and the level of comfort in which they operate.
That's certainly what most people we speak to say. I mean, that just is a reflection of how little fear they had of the repercussions.
Did you find things between the Urbina Soto family and the highest echelons of Honduran power? Their relationship is that they're part of the same party as the current president, Juan Orlando Hernandez. And when, Arnaldo Urbina Soto, who was the mayor, who was our sort of central figure here, and I haven't mentioned his name, but Arnaldo, had become because he's part of this very big municipality, it is the sort of head of the state operations, largest population-wise, very important. His sister became a congresswoman. So because they're a very politically important family, he became the head of the National Party's campaign effort during the presidential campaign for Juan Orlando. So, of course, Juan Orlando, when he was campaigning, he went out and campaigned next to them. So there are photographs and there's video of them, speaking and marching together and things like that.
It's hard to imagine that Juan Orlando did not know of their reputation. But I don't know. I mean, is it, I don't know, maybe it's a bit like sort of Harvey Weinstein in Hollywood, right? I mean, you kind of have to deal with them and no one says anything because, the results is that this guy's going to put Yodo in your pocket.
Right.
Yodo is an important part of your election. Sorry?
That's right. You don't necessarily need to be complicit or involved, but then there is a lot of power, certainly on a local level, to having the president come and, shake hands and slap backs, surely.
Absolutely, and it's not as if Juan Orlando Hernandez has not come under scrutiny himself. His brother, who is an alternate congressman, has come under scrutiny. We've spoken to officials who, in the United States government, who have called him a person of interest in investigations regarding drug trafficking. They haven't gone any further, and we should highlight that person of interest doesn't mean that he is under any formal investigation, but certainly, his name has come up as they are digging through and talking with people who are involved in criminal operations. So that has to be worrying for the president. The president's name has come up on occasion also with regards to the cachitos, specifically one of the court documents that has leaked out was a declaration that the person of the cachitos who declared all of these things in court had talked to a drug trafficker who said that he had given a couple of $100,000, I think is what he said, to the Juan Orlando campaign. We don't know if that's, Juan Orlando knew or not, but certainly that's something that has made life very difficult for a lot of politicians in the past, in places like Colombia, for instance.
It did provoke an official statement, did it not? From the
It did. It did. It provoked an official statement, and it's a long line of official statements that he's had to make. There's a third connection to drug trafficking in the Juan Orlando campaign, which is that a criminal figure, at least an accused or presumed criminal figure from another area, who had served as a person who was head of the Highway Construction Agency, also headed up a very important part of the presidential campaign. This guy and his brother have been linked to what's called the AA cartel. They've gone missing. Many people presume that they are in the United States or they are trying to negotiate some sort of arrangement with United States officials. So there's a lot of smoke, if you will, around the president, and this is as he's gearing up for a run at the presidency again.
So there are three parts to this latest investigation, and I urge our viewers to go and read it because it's great, and all three mayors seem like very interesting characters. But Steve, you can't go to every municipality and every department. How representative do you think these cases are of the sort of role of mayors in organized criminal structures in the region?
Well, we went through these three countries, and we looked at all the different mayors that have been charged with crimes, and they're in the dozens. I mean, in each one of these countries, there are over 15 mayors who have been charged. Not all of them have been convicted, of course, but in the range of 15 to 25 mayors in each one of these Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, have been charged with criminal activities. The charges range from, corruption charges to malfeasance to money laundering, in this case, to murder. So there's a wide range of charges connected to these mayors, and if there were some patterns that we would highlight, I think that they're related to the fact that these countries, like many countries around the region, not just these countries, but these countries that we looked at, have gone through changes, a lot of different changes that have opened the door for criminal groups to have these kind of relationships to mayors, or for criminals to become mayors, or for mayors to become criminals. So you have all these different things happening. One thing that I would say is that they are decentralized the system, the political system, so that the mayors have more say over, public works contracts and other contracting agencies. So mayors have more power than they've had before.
I mean, I was going to ask you, obviously, here in Mexico, this is a trend we've also seen.
Yeah.
But if you had to kind of put a time on it, when do you think that in recent years this kind of narco-political nexus has taken on more importance than it might have had, a decade ago or 20 years ago? Or?
Yes, it has, for that first reason, definitely, because they've had this sort of this process of decentralizing power. So mayors have more power than they used to have, because of a series of different laws and other things that have been implemented in all of these countries. And then the other thing is that they've simultaneously opened it up then for smaller companies and others to then participate in these state contracting services. So, the example I always bring up is the example of Guatemala, where they used to have about 80 big construction companies, and now they have over 2,000, which gives you an idea of the way in which this has been spread out. What this does is this gives people more opportunity on a local level to have direct contact with mayors and create what are in essence kind of fiefdoms, because it's kind of a I'll scratch your back and you scratch mine system. If you're a candidate for mayor, you will make arrangements with those who want to have contracts, state contracts, whatever they might be. And then when they get those state contracts, then they'll turn around and then feed your campaign and other needs you have as a politician. And many of those who are involved in that quid pro quo have criminal enterprises that are either central to what they do or parallel to the illicit enterprises that they have. So this is part of a process. We have to look at it as a process. It doesn't just happen overnight, and it is different from 20 years ago. So
we've got 2 minutes left, Steve. So to end, can you tell us what awaits then the mayor of Llorón now that he has been found guilty, I believe, of money laundering, even though everyone else got off?
Yeah.
What happens now?
Well, he's facing a long, I can't remember what his jail sentence is, but it was a pretty long jail sentence. He was initially in San Pedro Sula jail, which they are almost pretty much, if they haven't already, locking the doors on. They closed it down. It was such a poorly run facility. He was actually housed for a long time, and this was something we know firsthand because we were there inside the prison when he was there, although he didn't see us. But he was housed in an area that's called the area of private rooms. People pay for these private rooms. They give money to the administration, and some other prisoners go and build. It's by no means a 5-star hotel, but it's nicer than the rest of the place. Air conditioning, flat screen television, their own bathrooms, a small refrigerator, those sorts of amenities that the others don't have. So he's been moved to another facility now. I'm not sure which one. Chances are he'll be able to set himself up in that sort of situation. It should be noted that while he was in the San Pedro Sula prison, he kept meeting with those who continued to work at the mayor's office, and they kept engineering schemes, and they were busted, and these are the extra charges that they've tacked onto him. They were busted for engineering these schemes, where essentially like he would sign for these public works contracts that never happened, and then he would get the money from those public works contracts. So, you know, this is something that he could run even from jail for a time.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It's a little discouraging. It kind of maybe lessens the whole point of convicting and sentencing him in the first place, you would argue, if you carry on what he's doing. But that's great. Well, look, we've run out of time, but I would urge people watching to go read today's new investigation, and the final one will be published next week on the website, this time next week. I'm Deborah Bonello, Senior Investigator. I've been talking to co-director Steve Dudley, and we'll be back same time next week. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Deborah.